Chris Hill had always been the kind of guy who found beauty in the forgotten. Derelict buildings, crumbling walls, shattered windows, all these whispered stories to him that no one else could hear. That's why he'd become an urban explorer. But this warehouse, this forsaken labyrinth, was different. Something about it gnawed at him. His last visit had been a disaster. Yet here he was, standing at its entrance again, questioning his sanity. The warehouse loomed over him like a shadow that refused to disappear, even in daylight. His camera was in hand, the record button already blinking. "I'm back, and this is probably a very bad idea," he muttered to the lens, his voice betraying the fear churning inside him. If viewers were the reason he'd come back, he wasn't admitting it. But the truth was, the footage he'd captured during his last exploration had kept him awake at night. It wasn't just the sensation of being watched, or that cold, eerie feeling of someone or something touching him. No, it was what he hadn't noticed at the time. The dark silhouette that had appeared in the footage hovering in the background, following him without a sound. He hadn't seen it while exploring. He had only caught it when reviewing the tapes. And now, against every shred of logic, he was back. The warehouse greeted him with silence. Not the comforting kind, but the suffocating kind, where every breath felt too loud, too heavy. The wind outside barely whispered, and the world beyond the cracked walls seemed miles away. Chris swallowed hard and stepped inside, the cold air slapping him in the face as if to remind him he didn't belong here. His footsteps echoed as he made his way through the building, following the exact same path as last time. Dust particles floated in the dim light, disturbed by his presence, as though the place itself was waking up. The corridor came into view, the corridor that had nearly made him turn and run during his last visit. And just like before, the temperature dropped the second he stepped inside. "Wow, it's freezing in here again," he said, his voice trembling. He exhaled deeply, watching as his breath formed a visible cloud in front of him. Just like last time, the cold was real, tangible, but it was confined to this space. He stepped out of the corridor for a moment, testing the air beyond. Warmth greeted him, subtle but noticeable. Then he stepped back in, and the chill returned. Chris kept the camera trained on the corridor, hoping to capture any fluctuation, any sign that he wasn't alone. His breath fogged up again, confirming the unnatural cold. It was as though the warehouse itself was drawing him deeper, daring him to keep going. And because Chris Hill was nothing if not stubborn, or maybe a little mad, he kept moving. The corridor stretched before him, the kind of space that seemed to go on forever. His footsteps felt heavier with each step, like the floor itself was pulling him down, dragging him further into the belly of the beast. And then he reached it, the spot where he'd felt that ghostly touch before. Just standing there, he felt a deep, unsettling dread settle over him, as though the air itself was pushing down on him. He scanned the area with his camera, finding the faint blue light of his infrared setup in the distance, the very place he had set it up last time. But something was off. There was a small staircase nearby that he hadn't noticed before. A staircase leading down into a dark, cramped space he hadn't explored yet. Why hadn't he seen it before? The question barely had time to form before he started down the stairs, the heart pounding in his chest like a warning he was too stubborn to listen to. The space below was cold, colder than the corridor, colder than anything he had felt before. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. Then, without warning, a sound broke the silence, a whisper. low, deep, monotone. It crawled across the walls, wrapping itself around Chris like invisible fingers. He froze, every muscle tensing, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might explode. He strained his ears, but the whisper faded just as quickly as it had come. Whatever had made the sound was gone or hiding, waiting. Chris's throat was dry. He forced a laugh, a weak attempt to keep his fear at bay, but even he didn't believe it. He slowly turned around and climbed the stairs, eager to put the oppressive darkness behind him. But as he reached the top, a loud crash echoed through the corridor. A piece of debris, heavy and sharp, fell from above, landing just inches from where he stood. Chris jumped, his pulse skyrocketing. He whipped the camera around, trying to figure out where the debris had come from. What the hell? His voice was barely more than a breathless whisper. His eyes darted to the ceiling. Nothing was moving, nothing except the pounding of his own heart. Then the whisper returned, but this time it was closer. Too close. Chris's skin prickled with fear, every instinct screaming at him to run. But something rooted him to the spot. Something beyond terror. Something that twisted his gut and made his legs feel like lead. He was being watched. Again. Shaking, Chris turned the camera back toward the corridor. The infrared footage he'd set up was still recording, capturing everything. But what it caught made his blood run cold. A shadowy figure moved in the distance, slow, deliberate. It was barely there, a ghostly outline, but it was unmistakable. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Chris barely had time to react before he felt it. A hand, cold and visible, gripped him by the arm, yanking him forward. He stumbled, his legs giving out beneath him as he crashed to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of him, his head smacking hard against the concrete. Darkness swallowed him whole. When he came to, minutes had passed. His vision blurred, his head spinning. Groaning, he pushed himself up, heart pounding in his ears. He blinked, trying to make sense of where he was. But all he knew was one thing. He had to get out. Now. With trembling hands, Chris grabbed his gear and bolted. He didn't stop to look back, didn't stop to catch his breath. He didn't care what the camera had caught. He didn't care what the viewers would say. Whatever was in that warehouse, it had made itself known. And Chris knew, without a doubt, that it was never letting him go without a fight. He burst through the front door, lungs burning, body shaking. The cold outside felt like a relief compared to the icy grip of whatever had been inside. He stumbled down the street, every step a reminder of how close he had come to something beyond reason. He'd captured something on that camera, all right, something no one would believe unless they saw it with their own eyes. But one thing was certain, Chris Hill would never, ever return to that warehouse. Whatever had happened, whatever had reached out from the shadows, it wasn't finished with him yet. And this time, he wasn't willing to push his